So in the old town in Reykjavik, you can find the settlement exhibition, Reykjavik 871. And it tells the story of the settlement of Iceland. And it's centred on the remains of a Viking long hall. And just north of that hall, they found 2 pieces of turf, remnants of a wall which was built around the year 871. Now, this long hall excavation is one of the oldest man-made structures found in Iceland, and it was lived in by a Viking family up to the year 1000. I'm Helen Shaw, and this is Mother's Blood, Sister's Songs, the story of how the genetics of Iceland reveals its Gaelic roots. So to understand just how Iceland was settled by those Norwegian Vikings, and to find out what evidence it shows us of their slaves, I took a tour with curator Jón Páll Björnsson, and he walked me through this time capsule of history with all the sound effects of the long hall behind us.
I am Jón Páll Björnsson. I am a historian, and I work at the settlement exhibition in downtown Reykjavik. And we are at the settlement exhibition, which is an exhibition in downtown Reykjavik showcasing archaeological finds in this area. And these archaeological finds date back to the very earliest settlements of Reykjavik, which would also be among the earliest in Iceland.
So how long is this settlement exhibition museum here now, and kind of its significance in the city, because we're in a particular place as well that bears part of the story of settlement?
Yeah, well, this ruins from the settlement and archaeological excavations are nothing new here, and there are quite a number of such sites all around the country. What is unique about this one is that these ruins were found in an urban area. So they were deemed very good for display, and most other ruins that are excavated maybe in the countryside, they are simply recovered. That is how archaeology usually works. If there's no sort of construction going on, they are usually recovered. But for these, there was a unique opportunity to display this, although the building itself that we are showcasing here is ruined. It has no roof, and the walls have mostly collapsed. We have a sort of a complete picture of the ground plan, so we can very clearly see the size and the shape of the building. We see the entire inside floor, and a lot of artifacts were found both inside and outside, which give us a very good picture of the day-to-day life of the people here.
So, where we are now in the settlement exhibition, so open, almost oval-shaped room where you've created a sense of a visual impact of what you might see in the earlier settlement. So you might describe for us what's here.
So the centerpiece of the exhibition is this very large Viking-aged hall, or the ruin of one, that looks actually like this one large open oval area with a very bright sort of hearth or fire burning in the center of it. But we've done a lot of research on the ruin, so we know that it was subdivided, the interior, with walls. So we have these 4 main sort of divisions. There's a food storage, other storage facilities, there's a small animal stable, and there's this one large center space around the fire where the people lived. But given the size of this particular ruin, we estimate that this was for maybe 8 to 10 people. So it's a single family dwelling, most likely.
And obviously where we are is near the harbour of Reykjavik. We're near the water, so we're imagining that this was part of what would have been early settlement when people came in.
Yes.
But of course Reykjavik didn't exist. Maybe just give us, if you can, in that summary about, in the story you're telling here, how was Iceland settled?
So Iceland was settled, as far as we can tell, the earliest settlements are from 870. And parts of these ruins actually date from that particular period, which is the reason why we think Reykjavik is one of the earliest settled places in the country. The settlement would then progress for the next 60 years, and people settling all around the perimeter of the island, not in the interior, of course, because Iceland has a very rugged interior, very high interior, which would not support the type of habitation that was going on in the Middle Ages, but the perimeter, culminating in around 930, 60 years after the first settlers arrived. By that time, at least as the literary sources tell us, the country was completely settled and no new settlers arrived. So basically what they did was they put up a no vacancy sign, so nobody else came.
Now, in some ways, the obvious question is, who were they? Because in many ways, they've become part of the national narrative of settlement in persona and almost what we then inherit from the sagas. But from again, what's the story we tell of who they were in that 871, 874?
Well, the sort of physical culture we're seeing here is synonymous with the same types of cultures in other parts of Scandinavia, so most particularly Norway and Sweden. So these people who are first settling Iceland are what is commonly referred to today as Vikings. Of course, they did not call themselves Vikings. Vikings hardly ever used that phrase. And in fact, in the Middle Ages, nobody called the Vikings Vikings. It's a label that was put on them later. But for practical purposes, we always use this term because otherwise people get confused. But yes, these are Vikings. So in terms of the entire country, the number of settlers coming in this 60-year period, it's not completely clear, but it's been estimated at somewhere between 20 to 30,000 people. In the Reykjavik settlement, like it was probably in all other settlements, a community of people. Single-family settlements are possible, but they are always going to be very difficult because people, when they're coming into an unpopulated country and trying to establish a life for themselves, they need this sort of communal effort. So Reykjavik, as far as we can tell today, was probably a community of about 80 to 100 people. This is a large hall, a large Viking hall. In fact, we found 6 of them already, and there were probably more. We haven't actually excavated every square inch of downtown Reykjavik because these ugly modern houses are in the way. But if they were ever removed, hopefully, we will probably find more underground.
And you're talking about a community here, which is a single family in this one Viking hall. But I suppose from our interest in this, it's also the slave population. Slave or settlers, the people coming from what might be called the Gaelic world in Ireland, Britain. In a house like this, do you have a sense of how that would have been ordered with servants, slaves?
Material culture is not, material remains is not going to give us any indication of slavery, for instance, not directly. We have to rely on things like literary history, names, and of course genetic studies for that. However, this particular building was organized. We know how the interior was organized. There was this large single space around the fire. It was divided into 3 sections. In Viking culture, slaves were never housed in separate buildings. They always lived under the same roof. They were, in fact, a part, although a lesser part, but still a part of this extended family, so they are counted among them.
The story we're telling around us here in this hall, a sense of the daily life of these early settlers.
So, the daily life of the early settler, it's an agrarian life. It is a farm culture basing most of its products on animals and animal husbandry. This is the type of farming that was the focus of Iceland, still is. It's the focus of Icelandic farming is the rearing and using of domestic animals. The reason, of course, is that other types of cultivation in this country is quite difficult. Cultivating grain, for instance, it has to be coaxed out of the ground. And there are actually very few types of grain that will grow here. Chief among them is barley, but we do not think that the barley being cultivated in the Middle Ages was in any prodigious amount. So food like bread, for instance, was not what we consider a food staple. And no vegetables were grown here until the 1700s. Vikings did not grow fruit. So what we have is a culture basing their life on animals. The animals provide most of their diet. The animals provide their clothing as well. And most importantly, the industry, if we could call it that, it's a cottage industry.
Oh, this is lovely.
Okay, so
It's like a weaving room. So you might just tell us what we're looking at.
Okay, so we're standing next to a reproduction of a Viking age tool, which is called a loom, also referred to as a upright or a warp-weighted loom. It's not the type you sit at, it's the type you stand at. And what's being produced in this loom is a textile, a woolen material we refer to as vaðmál. And vaðmál is a very tough type of textile material produced extensively throughout the Viking world. And we find both literally and archaeological evidence for this everywhere. Basically everywhere there are Viking excavations, the probability of finding something connected to textiles is very high. You find pieces of these types of looms. You also find spindle whorls that were used for spinning thread. And one other thing about this type of weaving, it was very labor intensive. It took a long time to produce anything with a loom like this, so you would need a lot of labor. One of the things produced in looms like this, for instance, and a very important thing, was sails. Most Viking ships used woolen sails. The reason being that linen, which was later the most common material for sails, is produced from flax, and flax cultivation in Scandinavia was very limited. It's due to the climate, basically. So Vikings used wool for sails, but producing a woolen sail, which could be up to maybe a standard sail was maybe 90 square meters, would take an enormous amount of labor.
Because it's interesting because that this is women's work. Because one of the things it connects to with us is that we were talking to Bjara Grimsdottir, the folk singer, and she has all these wonderful spinning and weaving, and you can, when you think about what you've just said about the length of time, you can think these repetitive chants and using the rhyming songs would help you do such laborious work.
Spinning and weaving was exclusively, at least during the Viking Age, exclusively women's work. There are certain scholars who have argued, and quite convincingly, it's not women's work because they are being forced to do it. It is women's work because they are sort of making it their own, their priority. Because by having control of this particular type of production, they are basically have control of the underpinnings of the economy, and that's a lot of power. So these are women ruling over other women who might be doing the work. A lot of this would also be done by slaves, female slaves. A majority of the slaves were women. So why would they need women more than men? Again, quite possibly because of this textile production that was going on here. So spinning is something that's always going on. A single weaver might take up to 10 to 12 years for her to produce a single sail. If you have 12 women, the sail might only take a single year to produce.
Thank you so much. Best of luck with your day. And that was Jón Páll Björnsson at the Settlement Exhibition, the story of how people, both Viking chieftains and Gaelic slaves, started to farm and build lives in Iceland over 1,000 years ago. Thanks for listening.